I still remember the way the night air wrapped around me. It was too quiet for Fayetteville, the kind of quiet that warns you something is wrong before you even know what. I had just driven back from 2 weeks of training at Fort Liberty, my body tired but steady. I parked the car in the narrow driveway and noticed the porch light was still on at Linda's house. She always left it on pretending to be warm and welcoming, but that night the light felt like a spotlight over something rotten. As I stepped onto the damp grass, my boots crunching under the weight of silence, I caught a faint sound. It wasn't a cry. It was a gasp, small and broken, like someone trying to breathe underwater. My chest tightened before my mind could form a thought. I turned the corner into the backyard, and the world stopped moving. Harper was lying on the wet ground, her tiny frame curled against the cold, her wrists bruised dark, her pajama top damp, her lips trembling as she tried to pull in air, but no sound came out. My little girl, my mute little fighter. My knees hit the ground before I even realized I was moving. I scooped her up, pressing my hand against her back, feeling the fragile rise and fall of her breath. Her wide eyes locked on mine, full of fear, and her fingers clung weakly to my sleeve, like she was hanging on to the last thing she trusted in this world. I whispered her name over and over, hoping it would anchor her, hoping it would keep her with me. Then I saw them. Linda stood by the wooden fence, her silk robe hanging loose, a glass of wine dangling between two fingers as if nothing was wrong. Tara leaned against the railing with her arms crossed, her face twisted into a smirk that burned into my memory. There was no panic, no guilt, just a quiet cruelty that told me everything. I demanded to know what happened. Tara tilted her head slightly, and with a voice soft enough to chill my blood, she said, "She had it coming." That sentence ripped through me like a blade. My jaw locked, my hands shook. I wanted to scream. I wanted to make them feel the fear I saw in my daughter's eyes. But years in the military had taught me to hold the line. I pressed 2 fingers gently to Harper's throat. Her pulse was faint, but there. I inhaled, slowly, pulled out my phone and called 911. My voice came out flat, calm, professional. Age 8. Unconscious but breathing. Visible bruising. Location. Condition. My training wrapped around my rage like a vice. While I spoke, my eyes flicked to the porch camera, its red light blinking steadily. Recording. Evidence. Harper flinched at the distant wail of approaching sirens. I pulled her closer, whispering that she was safe, that Mommy was here. EMTs arrived within minutes, moving fast and precise. They lifted her gently, securing her on the stretcher as I followed, my jaw clenched so hard I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Linda muttered something about an accident on the stairs. Tara stayed quiet, her silence louder than any confession. The air smelled like wet earth and wine. As the ambulance doors shut, I stood in the harsh porch light staring at the 2 people who had just crossed a line they could never come back from. The night was silent again, but nothing in me was. I could feel every breath Harper had fought to take. I could see the bruises burned into her skin. And I knew this wasn't going to end with tears or begging. This was going to end in court. Before I tell you what happened when the police arrived, tell me where you're watching from. Because this night changed everything. To understand that night, you have to know how it all began. March 2025 wasn't the first time Linda Kane tried to take something from me. It was just the moment when I finally admitted she always had her eyes on what was mine. After my father died, Linda stepped into every corner of our lives like she had always belonged there. She wasn't the woman who raised me. She was the woman my father married late in life when I was already serving active duty. But after the funeral, she moved fast, as if grief was an opportunity and not a wound. The house became hers. The land became hers. Even the family savings went through her hands like water through a sieve. I didn't fight for the money. I fought for Harper. She was only 5 when my father passed, still small enough to think love could fix anything. Linda saw that softness as weakness. Tara had always hated Harper. I saw it in the way she rolled her eyes whenever my daughter tried to hand her a drawing or follow her around the yard. She called her names she thought Harper couldn't understand. She whispered cruel things just loud enough for me to hear when she thought no one else was listening. Harper being mute made her a target. To Tara, a child who couldn't speak was a child who couldn't fight back. She saw my little girl as a burden, not blood. Linda never corrected her. She fed it. She made sure Tara always felt like the heir to everything, even the pieces of my father that didn't belong to her. When I deployed to Iraq in 2022, I had no choice but to leave Harper with Linda temporarily. My unit was MP, and we were mobilized fast. I still remember the night I kissed Harper goodbye at the gate. She clung to my sleeve and pressed her small face into my uniform. She didn't say anything, of course. She never did. But her silence was the loudest sound I've ever heard. Linda smiled that night. It was a smile that said, "Don't worry, I'll take good care of her." A smile I should have never trusted. When I came back 10 months later, Harper didn't run into my arms. She just stood there in the airport terminal, clutching her stuffed rabbit wide-eyed and quiet in a way that was different, not her usual quiet. It was fear wrapped in silence. The first night back home, I found her sitting alone in the corner of her room, flinching when I reached for her shoulder. She'd always been shy, but she had never been afraid of me before. That was the first sign something was wrong. Linda brushed it off. She said Harper had trouble adjusting that kids got weird when their parents disappeared for too long. She said it like it was my fault, like my service to this country had made me a bad mother. Tara started calling Harper the little ghost. She laughed when she said it, and Linda never told her to stop. I didn't have the evidence to confront them then, but I started to watch everything more closely. Every time Harper came home from their house with a new bruise, there was always an excuse. She fell on the porch. She tripped over her own shoes. She got in the way. Linda had a way of twisting her face into this concerned mask like she was the one trying to protect Harper from the big bad world. But I knew better. I felt it. I just didn't have the proof to make it count. I spent years in the military learning how to keep calm under fire. I've handled active investigations. I've read bruises like maps, but nothing prepares you for reading them on your own child. The family court hearings became my second battlefield. Linda tried more than once to file for temporary custody while I was deployed, saying my job made me unstable. She told the court Harper needed a real home, as if the home I built wasn't real enough. I spent nights sitting in my barracks after long shifts filling out paperwork, calling lawyers between patrols, learning the language of custody law because I refused to let them take her. Tara got older, louder, more entitled. Linda's manipulation became sharper. She wore pearls and spoke softly in front of the judge, playing the part of a grieving widow who only wanted what was best for the child. She knew exactly how to twist the knife. She told people Harper wasn't safe with me because I was away too much. She said it so many times that I started to fear the system would believe her. The only thing that saved me was my record. 10 years of service, commendations, clean reports, a military lawyer who refused to let her rewrite the truth. But even after I won every legal challenge, she never let go. She stayed close like a shadow. She pretended to be kind when people were watching. Behind closed doors, she reminded me that everything I loved was one signature away from being ripped out of my hands. By 2025, I'd learned how to keep my guard up, but Harper hadn't. She still wanted to believe Linda cared. She still visited because she didn't understand the war being waged around her. Every time I saw her small hand in Linda's grip, I felt the chill of everything I'd fought to keep. And I knew something was building. I just didn't know when it would break. It started long before the bruises, long before the backyard, long before that October night. It started the day my father trusted the wrong woman, and I spent years trying to undo his mistake. September 2025 was when the whispers started to turn into bruises I couldn't ignore. They weren't the kind of bruises you get from falling off a bike or tripping on the porch steps. They were darker, shaped like fingers, like someone had wrapped their hand around my daughter's wrist and squeezed until her skin remembered it. Harper would come home from Linda's with long sleeves even on warm afternoons, clutching that old stuffed rabbit like it was the only safe thing she had left. I would roll her sleeves up to check her arms, and she would flinch not because of the pain, but because of the memories attached to it. She never said a word. She couldn't, but she didn't have to. Her silence had learned how to scream. Tara had also gotten meaner. Her words weren't just casual digs anymore. They were weapons. "She can't talk, Ember," she said one afternoon when I arrived early to pick Harper up. "Who's gonna believe her kids make things up?" But mute kids, they can't even explain it. She smirked like she'd just said something clever, but I saw it for what it was. A threat dressed as teenage cruelty. I wanted to break that smirk off her face, but I had learned the hard way that rage isn't evidence. My job in the military taught me something most people don't understand. Proof wins, emotion doesn't. So I started collecting proof. I began logging everything. Every bruise, every date, every time she came home looking smaller than she had when she left. I took photos with timestamps. I saved voicemails. I documented every visit in a small green notebook I kept hidden in the top drawer of my desk. It became my second weapon, quiet and sharp. When Harper started waking up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, I knew we had crossed a line. She didn't speak, but she would bolt upright in bed and press her hands over her ears. At first, I thought it was the nightmares she'd always had, the ones that crept in since the Iraq deployment years. But then, I noticed something new. She only reacted when she heard heels clicking on the tile floor. It was a very specific sound, and only one woman in her world wore heels every day. Linda. The first time it happened, I was in the kitchen making tea after a late shift. I had just taken off my duty belt when my boots made a dull thud against the floor. She didn't stir. But the next morning, as I got ready to take her to school, I slipped into a pair of dress shoes with a hard heel. The moment I stepped into the hallway, she shot up in bed like she'd been set on fire. She couldn't even look at me for a full minute. She pressed her hands over her ears, shaking her head like she could erase something that had already happened. My heart sank into the floor. I knelt next to her bed and whispered to her, even though I knew words weren't what she needed. She needed safety. I turned the shoes over in my hands and felt a heat rise in my chest that I hadn't felt since the worst days of Iraq. That was the night I decided to change everything. I had spent years being a soldier, first a mother, second, because the world kept demanding it from me. But this time, I didn't file for more overtime. I didn't sign up for another training block. I walked into my CO's office the next morning and requested a duty schedule adjustment. He looked at me with the quiet understanding of a man who had seen too many soldiers trying to balance wars at home and abroad. He signed it without hesitation. That single decision was the first act of rebellion. It meant more time at home, more control, more eyes on Harper. It meant less room for Linda to move in the dark. Tara's cruelty escalated as soon as she noticed I was showing up unannounced. She liked to whisper things just loud enough for me to hear. "What's the big deal?" "She bruises easy. You think you're some kind of hero because you wear a uniform? Nobody cares. She's broken anyway." Each word was like a spark landing on dry wood. I wanted to burn their lies down to ash, but I didn't. I waited. I watched. I documented. That's how you win a war when the enemy hides behind family walls. I caught small details. Harper's clothes always smelled faintly of Linda's perfume, a heavy floral scent she never changed. There were faint bruises around the same places on her wrists, like someone had grabbed her more than once. There were mornings she refused to go to school if she knew she'd have to stop by Linda's first. She didn't have the language to say why, but trauma doesn't need language to speak. My training had taught me how to recognize patterns. My instincts screamed louder every day. I reached out to a friend at JAG and asked what kind of evidence would hold up in a family court and possibly a criminal case. She didn't ask why. She just told me to keep everything and not confront them until I had what I needed. That was the first time I allowed myself to say the word in my own head. Abuse. Not discipline. Not a misunderstanding. Abuse. And that single word was like striking a match in the dark. I stopped hoping they'd change. I started preparing for the day they'd go too far. I didn't know when. I didn't know how. But I felt it building like a storm crawling closer each day. My house became quieter at night, not because there was peace, but because I was listening for something. The sound of heels, the sound of Harper's small gasps in her sleep, the sound of war shifting from whispers to something sharp enough to cut. I had worn my uniform in dusty streets overseas, holding a rifle and scanning for threats. But this time, the battlefield wasn't a war zone. It was home, and the enemy wasn't strangers. It was family. October 14th, 2025, 19:45. I can still hear the way her voice sounded. Tara, flat, cold. Harper fell down the stairs. No panic, no rush, no trace of concern. Just those words hanging in the air like a dead weight. I was sitting in my car outside the PX on post engine, still running halfway through a call with my squad leader about next week's shift rotation. I didn't even say goodbye. I dropped the phone onto the seat and slammed the gear into drive. The road from Fort Liberty to Linda's house wasn't long, but that night it stretched forever. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The sun had set, leaving the world under a thin veil of orange streetlights. It felt like the world already knew something had broken. When I pulled up to the house, the porch light was on, glowing the same way it did every night, but the air was heavier, as if it was holding its breath. I ran to the back without even knocking. That's when I saw her. Harper. On the wet grass. Bruises blooming across her small wrists, lips pale, chest rising in shallow, desperate pulls of air. The moment stretched into something unreal. It wasn't a fall. My training didn't need to be told. I'd seen this kind of bruising before. Hands, pressure, control. Linda stood near the fence, arms crossed, pretending nothing was wrong. Tara leaned on the railing, watching me. My world narrowed down to the sound of Harper's breathing and the thud of my boots against the ground. I scooped her into my arms, her body so light it terrified me. Her little hands twitched against my uniform like she was trying to grab onto something solid. I pressed my forehead against hers, whispering that I was here, that she wasn't alone. She couldn't answer. She never could, but her eyes said everything. I called 911 without shaking, but the storm inside me could have cracked concrete. I used my command voice, the one that left no room for hesitation. Unconscious but breathing, bruises on wrists, possible strangulation, location, time. Immediate response requested. I ended the call and held Harper tighter, willing the sound of sirens to come faster. Linda finally spoke. Her voice sweetened like she was talking to a neighbor about the weather. She fell down the stairs, ember. You know how clumsy she is. My head snapped toward her, and for 1 second the mask slipped. I saw the way her mouth twitched when she said it. She wasn't worried. She was covering. Tara shifted next to her, crossing her arms like she was bored. I kept my voice low and steady. Do not speak again. I think that was the first time Linda looked at me and saw something she couldn't control. The EMTs arrived fast. Their boots pounded on the steps, their voices clipped and professional. One of them knelt next to Harper, checking her vitals. I stepped back, just far enough to give them space, but close enough that they could hear my breathing. When they lifted her onto the stretcher, one of them glanced at me. "This doesn't look like a fall," he said quietly. His partner nodded at the bruises on her wrists and neck. "We're noting this. She needs a full exam." My jaw tightened. I didn't have to explain. They already knew. Years of emergency calls make you fluent in reading what people don't say out loud. Tara leaned against the porch post and rolled her eyes as if the whole thing was some kind of inconvenience. Linda clutched her robe like she was starring in some sad little play about a worried grandmother. I watched them and felt something inside me lock into place. There wasn't any confusion left, no room for doubt. This wasn't going to end with more whispered threats or hidden bruises. The ambulance door shut, taking Harper to the one place I knew she'd be safe for a few hours. The house fell silent again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was sharp, like a blade being unsheathed. Linda started to speak again, probably ready to spin another lie, but I didn't let her. I turned to her slowly, every muscle in my body burning with control I had spent years learning. If I lost it now, if I let rage speak, they'd twist it into a weapon against me. I've seen it happen in court. I've seen women lose everything because their fury was louder than their proof. So I kept my voice quiet. This ends tonight. Her face flickered for the briefest second. Not guilt. Fear. She knew exactly what I meant. The sirens faded into the distance, carrying Harper away, but something else had arrived in their place. A storm. My storm. I straightened my back shoulders, square feet planted like I was back on duty in the middle of a patrol zone. Linda tried to hold my stare. She failed. Tara tried to smirk. It cracked. And for the first time since this war began, I felt the power shift. Not enough to win yet, but enough to start burning everything they built. I walked to my car without another word. The night smelled like wet dirt and cheap perfume. My phone buzzed with the hospital's incoming notification. I started the engine and whispered to myself, steady as steel, no one touches my child. The cold in an ICU room is different. It isn't just temperature. It's the kind of cold that settles under your skin, the kind that makes time move slower, like every second is forcing you to notice how fragile life really is. I sat in that chair next to Harper's bed at Womack Army Medical Center, staring at the thin line of light cutting through the blinds and pooling over my boots. The smell of disinfectant clung to everything. Machines beeped in steady, cruel rhythm, reminding me with every sound that she was still here but hurt. My uniform felt too stiff on my skin, like the fabric remembered every deployment I had ever been through. I had worn it in Iraq when I ran toward the sound of gunfire. I had worn it when I dragged injured men from burning vehicles. I had worn it when I told families their loved ones weren't coming home. But tonight, I wasn't fighting for strangers. I was fighting for my child. Harper's small body was dwarfed by the white sheets and the railings around her bed. Her wrists were bandaged where the bruises had already started to darken. She had an oxygen line running under her nose and monitors taped to her chest. I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She didn't stir. She was resting under sedation, safe from the fear she'd lived through hours earlier. A doctor had already told me she wasn't in critical danger. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but her trauma was. They called it psychological distress. I called it something else, a wound that didn't bleed, a wound that I was going to make them answer for. The door opened softly behind me, the sound too familiar. Military boots on a polished floor. Captain Rebecca Hayes stepped in her uniform crisp, her face calm but eyes blazing with something only soldiers carry when they see injustice hit too close. She had been my friend for years. We'd been through a deployment together. We'd buried people together. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of Harper in that bed. And then she said, "Ember, this isn't just family business. It's a criminal case." Her voice wasn't soft. It was steel. I looked up at her and I didn't have to say a word. She already knew I wasn't going to let this slide. I already started a file, she added, stepping closer. "I've contacted CID. If what you told me is even half of what happened, this falls under both state and federal jurisdiction. We're going to hit them from every angle." My throat tightened. I had spent my career enforcing laws and protecting others. Now the system had to protect my daughter. I wasn't going to let it fail her. I looked back at Harper and felt the tears sting my eyes before they even formed. But they didn't fall like weakness. They burned like fuel. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, straightened my shoulders, and felt something old and familiar slide back into place. My soldier's spine. "I want everything," I said quietly. Rebecca nodded once. "Then let's start with the camera footage." The doorbell camera on Linda's house had been recording. I remembered the small blinking light when I held Harper in my arms. It was my first weapon. "We'll get a warrant or at least secure the footage before they try to erase anything," she said. "But Ember, you need to prepare yourself. This won't just be about the video. We'll need medical reports, statements, a full CPS involvement. You're not just a mother here. You're a witness." The words hit like a weight, but they didn't crush me. They steadied me. I know I answered. I've been a soldier long enough to understand what a battlefield looks like. And this is one. Rebecca crouched next to Harper's bed. Her expression softened for just a second as she looked at my little girl. "She's tough," she whispered. "She'll get through this." I nodded even though a part of me was shaking inside. She didn't see the nights Harper woke up clutching that rabbit. She didn't see the way Harper flinched at the sound of heels. But I did, and I wasn't going to let anyone ever make her feel like that again. After Rebecca left to file the paperwork, I sat in the silence with Harper. The machines hummed. The hallway echoed with distant footsteps. I stared at my reflection in the window. The same woman who had once stood in a war zone was now standing in the middle of a different kind of war, one where the enemy wore my father's last name. I pulled out my notebook and started writing. Not just feelings, facts, dates, details. Tara's voice on the phone, the bruises on Harper's wrists, the porch light, the camera, Linda's wine glass, every small detail I could remember, because I knew one thing for sure: people like Linda hid behind the messiness of family. They used silence like a shield, but this time the silence was mine to break. At 02:00, a nurse came in to check Harper's vitals. She looked at me like she wanted to ask questions but didn't. Maybe she'd seen this before. Maybe too many mothers in uniform had sat in this same chair realizing the worst fight they'd ever face wasn't in another country, but right here at home. When the nurse left, I opened my phone and started the first call. CPS, Child Protective Services. It didn't matter that it was the middle of the night. I left a recorded statement with all the key facts, made sure it was logged. Then I called my CO. My voice was steady when I told him I needed temporary adjustment of duty to handle a criminal case involving my child. He didn't argue. He just said, "Handle it, Sergeant. We'll cover you." That was the thing about soldiers. When one of us goes to war, the others build the line behind us. Rebecca texted me 10 minutes later. CID was looped in. They were already prepping an investigator to take my statement in the morning. She also told me something I already knew but needed to hear. Don't lose your head. They'll try to make you the angry soldier mom. Don't give them that weapon. I stared at my daughter's small chest rising and falling and made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to break. I was going to win. At around 03:00, exhaustion finally started to press down on me, but I didn't close my eyes. Sleep didn't belong in this room. Not tonight. Instead, I remembered Iraq. I remembered the heat, the sand, the weight of a rifle pressed against my chest, the way fear smells like metal and sweat. I remembered the moment you stop shaking, not because you stop being scared, but because your mind switches from panic to strategy. That's where I was now. Strategy. I wrote a list. Step 1, secure camera footage. Step 2, coordinate CPS. Step 3, full medical documentation. Step 4, prepare legal strategy with Rebecca. Step 5, make sure no one, not Linda, not Tara, not anyone, ever comes near Harper again. I didn't have to be calm. I had to be precise. A soldier doesn't win wars by being louder. A soldier wins by being relentless. I leaned closer to Harper, resting my forehead gently on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the wires. "They'll never touch you again," I whispered. My voice was steady. My hands were not. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath proof that I hadn't lost her. Not tonight. Not ever. The hallway lights outside flickered as night shifted into morning. By the time the sun started bleeding through the blinds, my tears had dried on my cheeks, but my eyes felt sharper than they had in years. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. And I was done letting them hide behind family. The morning after Harper was moved from ICU to a recovery room, something inside me shifted. The grief, the fear, the helplessness, they didn't disappear. They hardened. They turned into something sharp, something steady, something I could use. I had spent years learning how to build cases as a military police sergeant. I knew how to gather evidence, how to stay 3 steps ahead of people who thought they were untouchable, and Linda Kane had spent too long thinking she was untouchable. Over the next 8 days from October 17th to October 25th, I turned everything I knew inward and used it to build a war she couldn't win. It started with the camera. I'll never forget the way Rebecca's voice sounded on the phone that first morning. "We've got the footage." There was no hesitation, no doubt. She had gone through the legal channels faster than most civilians could ever hope to. When I got to the JAG office, the footage was already downloaded, secured, and time-stamped. It wasn't just a blur. It wasn't something that could be argued away. It was clear. Harper standing near the porch steps, clutching her little rabbit. Linda's hand clamping down on her wrist. Tara swinging. The image burned itself into my brain like acid. Tara's face wasn't even blurred by hesitation. She looked almost pleased with herself. Linda didn't look shocked. She looked steady, like this wasn't the first time. I didn't look away, not once. I watched the entire recording with Rebecca standing behind me. The room felt smaller with every second. When the screen went black, I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch just long enough to feel the weight of what I'd just seen. Rebecca broke it first. "This is enough to start a criminal case. And Ember, once this goes forward, it's going to move fast. Are you ready for that?" My hands tightened into fists on the edge of the table, but my voice was calm. "I've been ready since the night she couldn't breathe." From there, everything moved like a deployment op. CID got involved the same day. They opened an official investigation, logged the footage, collected my sworn statement, and scheduled forensic interviews. A detective from Cumberland County coordinated with CID to make sure the case ran both through the civilian and military channels, which meant Linda and Tara wouldn't be able to hide behind jurisdiction. It didn't matter that they were family. It didn't matter that they'd probably thought no one would ever take the word of a mute child. I made sure the world was listening. Harper's watch was the next piece. I had bought it for her birthday because it had a built-in GPS tracker. It wasn't meant for this. It was meant to make sure I always knew where she was when duty called me away. But now it was a silent witness. Rebecca brought in a technical analyst, and within hours, they confirmed the timestamp from the camera matched the GPS data to the second. It placed Harper in the exact location where the assault happened, eliminating any chance of a fabricated story about her falling somewhere else. Then came the medical reports. The military doctors at Womack were thorough. They documented every bruise, every mark, every pattern consistent with force. One physician, a quiet man with 20 years of service, told me softly, "Sergeant, this was intentional." He said it like he had said it too many times in his life. They signed their reports, entered them into the record, and I requested certified copies. Every piece was fitting together like a structure that couldn't be knocked down. Linda and Tara probably thought they had time. They probably thought they'd spin some story about accidents, clumsiness, misunderstandings. But they had no idea what it was like to go against someone trained to hunt for the truth. By October 20th, Rebecca was sitting across from me in her office. She slid a thin folder toward me. "Criminal complaint is ready. Cumberland County is moving forward with charges for child abuse and assault causing injury. Linda and Tara are both named." I stared at the folder for a moment, not because I doubted what I was about to do, but because this was the line. The one you cross when there's no way back to pretending this is just family. I picked it up and signed. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just breathed in and felt the steel settle deeper into my chest. That night, I drove past Linda's house. I didn't stop. I didn't knock. I just sat across the street in the dark and stared at that porch light. They had no idea the storm that was coming for them, and that was the part that made it easier to breathe. On October 22nd, CID brought me in for a final interview. It wasn't my first. I'd sat in that same chair 100 times before, usually on the other side of the table asking the questions. But this time, I was the one giving the statement. I told them everything. I told them about the bruises, the way Tara looked at me when she said no one would believe Harper, the sound of Linda's heels, the first panic in Harper's eyes, the way the night smelled like wine and wet earth. I spoke with the clarity of someone who knew exactly what the truth was and had the evidence to match it. When they asked if I wanted to pursue charges, I looked them straight in the eyes and said I don't want to pursue them. I already did. On October 25th, I got the official notice. Linda and Tara were being formally charged. Their court date was being set. I folded the paper and slipped it into my uniform pocket like a mission order. I walked down the hallway of the JAG office with my back straight, my face unreadable. My fellow soldiers nodded as I passed some of them, knowing some of them not, but all of them recognizing the look on my face. It was the look of someone who had chosen a fight and was not planning to lose it. When I got back to the hospital that night, Harper was asleep. Her small hand curled around that rabbit. I sat next to her bed and let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't the same kind of quiet from that night in the backyard. This one was sharp like a blade being drawn. My emotions sat beneath the surface, controlled and caged, because that's what wins wars. Rage burns fast. Strategy lasts. I brushed Harper's hair off her forehead and whispered to her like she could hear me in her dreams. "I've got you." This time they don't get to walk away. My phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. Everything was moving. The DA was on board. CPS was fully engaged. Linda's lawyer had already reached out. That told me they were scared, and they should be, because this time they weren't facing a broken mother. They were facing a soldier who knew exactly how to dismantle them piece by piece. If this were your child, what would you do? Tell me below. The courtroom felt too warm that morning, like the air itself was holding its breath. It was October 30th, Cumberland County Courthouse, and every seat in the room was filled. Local reporters sat with their cameras perched like hawks on a branch. There were neighbors, soldiers in uniform, civilians, even a few people I didn't recognize but who had read the story in the paper and wanted to see what justice would look like. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a spotlight, a mirror, a reckoning. I walked in wearing my uniform not because it made me feel strong, but because I wanted Linda to see exactly who she was standing against. Staff Sergeant Ember Collins, MP, mother, soldier, not a broken daughter, not a scared woman. When I stepped through the doors, heads turned. I kept my back straight, my boots steady against the tile. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against me, but it didn't make me shrink. It made me stand taller. Linda was sitting at the defense table, her hair brushed to perfection, her pearl earrings shining under the fluorescent lights. She wore a soft blue cardigan, the kind meant to make her look gentle like someone's fragile grandmother. Tara sat beside her, shoulders stiff, her once cocky expression replaced with a pale mask. Their lawyer hovered close, whispering, rearranging papers, crafting allusions. The judge called the hearing to order, voice firm and calm. This is a public proceeding regarding charges of aggravated assault, child abuse, and reckless endangerment. The words echoed off the walls like small explosions. The DA laid out the case with precision, step by step, date by date, charge by charge. I didn't look at Linda. I didn't need to. She wasn't the center of this story anymore. Harper was. When the defense attorney stood, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. His suit was expensive, his smile rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is a tragic misunderstanding. A child fell. A family is being torn apart by exaggeration. And unfortunately, this child cannot speak for herself. She cannot tell us what happened." He paused for effect, letting the word mute hang in the air like an accusation. "And without that, what do we really have here, hearsay? A family dispute taken too far." For a second, the room was silent. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Harper couldn't speak, but I could. I stood. The movement was quiet but firm. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like to address the court, not as a witness, not as a plaintiff, as the mother and as a staff sergeant in the United States Army Military Police." The judge studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." I walked to the front, the sound of my boots echoing through the room. I didn't need a script. I didn't need to rehearse the truth. I turned toward the screen the DA had set up. "This child doesn't need words," I said, "because the truth speaks for itself." Rebecca pressed play. The footage filled the screen. It was clear. Harper standing by the porch, Linda's hand gripping her wrist, Tara raising her hand, the impact, Harper stumbling, the fear in her eyes, the sound of her gasping, even without her voice, even without a single word, was enough to make the room shift. No one moved. No one coughed. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Reporters froze mid-note. Jurors leaned forward like gravity itself had pulled them closer. Linda's mask cracked first. Her hand twitched against the table. Tara's face drained of color. Their lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a single look. "The footage will be entered into evidence," she said. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I didn't shake. I stood in front of that courtroom like I had stood at checkpoints in Iraq, focused, controlled, unbroken. "My daughter may not have a voice," I said, turning toward the jury. "But what you just saw is louder than any testimony she could have given. I've spent years serving this country, protecting strangers from violence. But the night of October 14th, the violence wasn't on a battlefield. It was on my father's porch. It was two people who were supposed to protect her, and instead, they made her a target. I won't let anyone diminish what happened to her because she doesn't speak. Silence isn't weakness. It's evidence. One juror wiped their eyes. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. Even a reporter lowered his pen, staring at the screen like he'd just watched something he couldn't unsee. The DA let the silence sit. It didn't need more words. The truth had already taken up all the air in the room. Linda's tears finally fell, but they weren't the kind that came from guilt. They were the kind that came from being cornered. Tara stared at the table shoulders, hunched, mouth tight. For years they had hidden behind whispers and power games, but the world was watching now and they had nowhere to run. The footage shows physical restraint and active assault, the DA said. It aligns with the medical reports, the GPS data, and the timeline provided by the responding EMTs. There is no ambiguity here. This child was hurt deliberately. I stood still, my hands clasped behind my back, my posture military perfect. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't let a single flicker of pain break the steel in my eyes. Because this wasn't just about justice. This was about making sure every person in that room understood that Harper mattered, that her silence was not permission. It was proof. The judge's gaze lingered on Linda longer than it had all morning. Tara tried to avoid looking at anyone. I could feel the eyes of the press locking onto me, the weight of their cameras framing this moment. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that for the first time, Linda and Tara were the ones shrinking. I was no longer the woman they thought they could manipulate. I was the one standing in the light, and they were the ones exposed. When I returned to my seat, Rebecca's hand brushed against my arm, not to comfort, but to anchor. She whispered, "They don't come back from that." I looked toward the screen, now black, and exhaled slowly. No tears. Just resolve. What they had done was no longer a secret passed through court filings. It was a truth carved into the record played in a courtroom felt by strangers who would never forget it. Public exposure. A moment that belonged not just to me, but to Harper, and to every silent child who needed someone to speak for them. The gavel's crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, final and merciless. It was November 5th, 2025. After weeks of evidence testimony and the public exposure that stripped every ounce of their lies bare, the verdict was in. Linda Kane was sentenced to 12 years in state prison for child abuse and conspiracy to commit assault. Tara Kane received 7 years. No probation, no suspended sentence, no deal. Just cold, hard time. As the judge read the sentence, a hush fell over the room, the kind of hush that comes when justice doesn't just whisper, it roars. I didn't smile, I didn't clap. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I just stood there, hands at my sides, back straight. My uniform pressed my boots, planted like roots in the polished courtroom floor. I had waited for this day, not to watch them fall, but to watch my daughter rise. Linda's face crumpled first. She had kept her composure throughout the trial, dressing in soft sweaters, carefully applying makeup to look fragile and motherly, but that facade cracked the moment reality finally touched her. She gasped like someone had pulled the air out of the room. Tara just stared at the table, jaw clenched, tears threatening, but not falling, as if she still didn't understand how something she thought would stay buried had become a headline. The judge's voice was calm, but final. "You have both inflicted intentional harm upon a child. You used your authority as family to cover that harm. The law will not allow that." Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the hum of whispered reactions filled the space like static. CPS representatives stood on the side waiting for the official paperwork to be handed down. They weren't just watching a sentencing. They were preparing to make sure Harper was never touched by these people again. When the judge announced the permanent no-contact order, something inside me finally exhaled. No shared custody, no supervised visits, no phone calls, no letters, nothing. Linda and Tara were erased from Harper's world legally permanently. They could rot in their separate cells, but they would never again breathe the same air as my child. That was justice, not revenge. Justice. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed like a tide. The story had grown far beyond the borders of Fayetteville. It had spread across North Carolina, picked up by military family networks, child protection advocates, and local news channels. Cameras lined the steps, microphones pointed like bayonets. I could have walked past them, but I didn't. I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps in full uniform, Harper's photo pinned inside my breast pocket. I had spent too many years letting other people write the story. This time, I would speak for us. A reporter shouted the first question. "Sergeant Collins, what do you want to say to those who followed this case?" I met her eyes steady as if I were standing in formation. No one touches my child. No one. And if they try, they will face the full weight of the law. The crowd erupted with the chaotic energy of cameras flashing and pens scratching across notepads. But underneath that noise was something else, a pulse of quiet respect. Not pity, respect. Because the uniform on my shoulders didn't belong to a victim, it belonged to a soldier who had turned her pain into precision. As the van carrying Linda and Tara rolled away from the courthouse flanked by sheriff deputies, I didn't look at them. They had occupied enough space in my life. Their power over me ended the moment the verdict was spoken. I turned my attention to Harper. She wasn't there in person, too young, too fragile for this circus. But she was waiting at home with her therapist and a trusted friend from the unit. I could already picture her in the living room, that little rabbit clutched to her chest, the soft blanket over her legs, the quiet strength she carried without even knowing it. That strength had guided me every step of the way. Over the next weeks, things began to shift. Not easily, not perfectly, but they shifted. CPS sent confirmation letters that the no-contact order had been logged in every relevant system. The base legal office coordinated with the DA to make sure Linda and Tara's convictions were listed in every child protection registry they qualified for. Rebecca and I sat in her office going over the aftermath. There was always paperwork, always fallout. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like closure being built brick by brick. Harper began trauma therapy 3 days after the sentencing. The first session was quiet, her therapist sitting cross-legged on the floor with picture cards and soft lights. Harper didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. The way she reached out and touched the therapist's hand, the way she allowed someone to sit close without flinching, that was progress. A week later, she drew a house with just the two of us inside. No shadows at the windows, no figures standing outside. Just us. Safe. Every night I sat by her bed after she fell asleep and listened to her breathing. It wasn't shallow anymore. It wasn't filled with tremors. It was steady, soft, almost like the way she breathed as a baby when the world hadn't touched her yet. I held on to that sound. It reminded me why every second of this battle had mattered. One evening, the news played a segment about the sentencing. I hadn't planned to watch, but the anchor's voice drifted from the television in the kitchen. They showed a still image of me on the courthouse steps. My jaw set the caption below, reading, "No one touches my child." It felt strange seeing those words on a screen, but it also felt right, because they weren't just mine. They belonged to every parent who had fought against silence, against shame, against the cruelty hidden behind closed doors. Harper's therapist reported steady improvement over the following weeks. Harper was responding to therapy, building trust again, sleeping through the night. She still didn't speak, but one afternoon, as she sat on the couch coloring, she looked up at me with wide, clear eyes and signed a single word with her hands, "Safe." My chest tightened. I knelt beside her and signed back, "Always." Rebecca came by that weekend with takeout and 2 cups of bad coffee. She dropped her hat on the counter, looked at me across the kitchen, and said, "You know you didn't just win this case. You changed the way this town looks at silence." I didn't have a response for that. I just sipped my coffee and looked at the quiet house around me. There were no footsteps that didn't belong, no voices trying to rewrite the truth. Just peace, thin and fragile, but real. And real was enough. The sentence didn't erase the scars. It didn't undo the pain. But it drew a line in the sand, one Linda and Tara could never cross again. And for the first time since that night, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next blow. Harper and I walked to the park that Sunday morning. The air was cool, the leaves beginning to turn. She ran ahead, hair flying behind her, the sunlight catching the soft pink of her sweater. I stood there for a long time watching her, realizing that the future finally belonged to us again. Not to fear, not to silence, not to them. This was the aftermath. Not the end, but the beginning of something clean, quiet, free. 2 months after the verdict on a gray morning in early January, I opened my mailbox and found a letter that smelled faintly of bleach and cheap paper. The return address was from the North Carolina Correctional Facility for Women. It was written in the shaky cursive I knew too well. Linda Kane. My stepmother. The woman who had spent years trying to control my life. The woman who had stood there while my child gasped for air. I didn't rip it open. I took it inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for a long time. Harper was at therapy. The house was quiet, filled with the gentle ticking of the kitchen clock. I had learned to live with silence in these past weeks, but this silence felt different, thicker, heavier. I finally slit the envelope open with a small paring knife. The letter was 3 pages long. I read every word slowly. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was the kind of letter people write when they've been stripped of power and are desperate to claw some of it back. She wrote about how prison was lonely, how she missed family, how she regretted everything that happened. And then, she wrote the line that froze my hand mid-air. Please bring Harper to see me. I need to say I'm sorry to her face. I could almost hear her voice, calm, manipulative, the same tone she used to talk me into handing over decisions when I was younger. But that voice didn't live rent-free in my head anymore. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer. Not the trash, not the table. A drawer, because it meant nothing. It deserved nothing. A week later, Rebecca showed up at my door with a manila folder under her arm. "You're not going to like this," she said. We sat at my kitchen table. She slid the folder toward me. Inside was a formal petition from Tara Kane's lawyer. She was seeking a sentence reduction citing emotional distress young age and a desire to reform. She had also submitted a letter claiming she wanted to apologize in person and make amends. My hand didn't tremble. My breathing didn't change. I had expected this. People like them always come back when the reality of consequences finally sinks in. They don't come back because they've changed. They come back because they've lost control. Rebecca watched me carefully. "We'll have to appear at the hearing," she said. "Do you want to give a statement?" I met her eyes and said, "Yes, and it's going to be the last time they ever hear my voice." The hearing was set for late January. It wasn't like the trial. No reporters this time, no packed gallery, just a smaller courtroom, legal counsel, the judge, a few officers, and me. Linda's petition had been attached to Tara's an attempt to bundle their plea into one desperate grasp for leniency. They didn't appear in person. Instead, they sat behind the thick glass of the correctional facility faces projected on a monitor at the front of the room. Tara's hair was shorter now, uneven, like prison life had started to strip away the polish. Linda looked older. The cardigan and pearls were gone. She was wearing the standard khaki prison uniform. No soft lighting, no rehearsed smiles, just the harsh glare of fluorescent bulbs that didn't let anyone hide. The judge began by reading their requests. Tara's lawyer spoke first, his tone smooth but thin. "My client acknowledges the harm caused and has expressed sincere remorse. She has demonstrated good behavior during her time in custody and wishes to begin a process of rehabilitation and reconciliation with her family." Linda's attorney echoed the same sentiment, dressing manipulation in polite words. "Mrs. Kane would like the opportunity to apologize to her granddaughter. She has reflected deeply and is seeking a chance to reconnect to make amends." When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium wearing my uniform, not because it was required, because it mattered. My boots hit the floor with measured weight. The microphone crackled softly as I leaned toward it. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at their lawyers. I looked at the monitor where Linda and Tara sat behind glass. "Your Honor," I began, my voice even. "I've listened to their words. I've read their letters, and I understand the language they're using very well. I've spent over a decade as a military police sergeant. I've heard countless versions of these same pleas. Regret reconciliation, remorse. But none of it changes what happened." I let the silence settle before continuing. 2 months ago, I watched a courtroom full of people see what they did to my daughter. I watched the truth strip them bare, and now, with nothing left, they're asking for pieces of the life they destroyed. They are not entitled to that. Not now. Not ever. Linda flinched at the word destroyed. Tara lowered her head, but didn't look away. They lost the right to be part of Harper's life, I said clearly, each word hitting like a hammer the night they raised their hands against her. That was the night they made their choice, and I made mine. I turned slightly toward the judge. They don't get to ask for time, or forgiveness, or a stage to perform their regret. My daughter is 8 years old. She has scars they gave her. She has panic attacks at night because of them. She is relearning how to trust, how to feel safe. That is her work. That is my work. They don't get to be part of that journey. They forfeited that right. The judge watched me carefully, pin poised, but said nothing. I could feel Rebecca's steady presence behind me like an anchor. I stepped closer to the microphone, lowering my voice slightly, not out of softness, but control. I want to be very clear. If the court grants them leniency, they will try again. Not with violence, but with words. They will send letters. They will whisper through the cracks. They will try to crawl back into a space they burned down. I am here to make sure that never happens. My daughter deserves to grow without their shadow on her. For the first time, I let my gaze lock fully on Linda. She was crying, not the trembling tears of guilt, the bitter ones of a woman who realized her power was gone for good. Tara wiped her face too, but it was the same kind of hollow crying, the kind that starts when you finally understand consequences aren't reversible. The judge leaned forward. "Do you have anything further?" "Sergeant Collins?" I shook my head. "No, Your Honor, that's all I needed to say." I stepped back, my heartbeat steady, my hands relaxed. Linda's lawyer fidgeted with his papers. Tara's lawyer repeated his lines about youth and rehabilitation, but it was just noise now. The judge didn't rush. She sat with the silence, the kind of silence that means a decision is already forming. "The petition for sentence reduction and contact privileges is denied," she finally said. "This court recognizes the severity of the original crime and the ongoing impact on the victim. This sentence stands." A soft click echoed through the room as the monitor turned off. 1 second they were there, their faces full of unwanted pleas, and the next they were gone, replaced by the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. No screaming, no drama, just erasure. The guard at the back opened the door for me, and I walked out without looking back. In the hallway, Rebecca caught up with me. "You did exactly what needed to be done," she said, her voice low and even. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the glass door at the end of the hall, the winter light pouring through it. "They're never getting back in," I said finally. She nodded. "No, they're not." Outside, the air was sharp and cold, the kind that burns a little when it hits your lungs but clears your head. I walked to my truck, the same one that had carried me to court during the trial, and sat in the driver's seat for a while before turning the key. I thought about that night in October when I found Harper on the ground. I thought about the ICU, the video, the verdict. The silence that used to make me feel small now felt clean, like a house with all the windows open. That was what this hearing was about. Not punishment, boundaries. Real, permanent, unbreakable boundaries. When I got home, Harper was building a puzzle on the living room rug. She looked up when she heard the door open, her hair falling across her face, the rabbit still tucked under her arm. I knelt beside her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She didn't ask what happened, and I didn't tell her. She didn't need to carry that weight. That was mine to hold. Instead, she pointed to the puzzle piece she couldn't fit, and I guided her hand to turn it the right way. It clicked into place with a soft sound that felt louder than the entire courtroom had. Over the following days, life settled back into its rhythm. Therapy sessions, school mornings, evenings filled with puzzles, books, soft laughter. Sometimes Harper would reach out in the middle of the night just to make sure I was still there, and I always was. That was the life Linda and Tara had no part in anymore. That was the wall they would never climb. Rebecca visited again, a week later, paperwork in hand, finalizing the records so there would be no loopholes left to exploit. I signed them without hesitation. "This closes every door," she said, and every window, I replied. In early February, a counselor from the Victim Support Unit called to check in. They asked if Harper or I needed any additional services now that the hearing was over. I almost said no, but then I heard Harper laughing softly in the background, a sound that was slowly becoming more frequent. I told them, "We're okay." And for the first time, it wasn't a line to keep moving forward. It was the truth. That night, I went through the drawer where Linda's letter still sat. I held it in my hands, feeling the cheap paper between my fingers. It didn't sting anymore. It didn't even make my pulse quicken. It was just a letter from a woman who no longer had any power here. I walked out to the fire pit in the backyard, struck a match, and watched it burn. The flames curled the paper inward, blackened the ink, and erased her last attempt to crawl back into our lives. I didn't look away until the last corner turned to ash. The next morning, Harper came running into the kitchen holding up a drawing she'd made. It was a house by the lake, a stick figure of her and me, and a small dog she'd been asking for since she could sign the word friend. There were no dark corners in the drawing, no extra figures, just us. "That's our future," I whispered. She grinned, and though she didn't speak, that smile was louder than anything Linda or Tara could have ever said. People sometimes imagine closure as an explosion, a grand finale where everything resolves with a bang. But mine came in the form of a letter turned to ash, a courtroom gone quiet, a little girl fitting a puzzle piece into its place. That was enough. That was everything. The audacity of their return hadn't shaken me. It had reminded me who I had become. I was no longer the woman standing outside in the dark, begging for justice. I was the one who had built walls they could never breach again. And that in its silence was the loudest victory of all. Spring came slowly that year, the kind that unfolded like a quiet promise. The trees along Spring Lake were bright with new leaves, the water still cool from winter, but shimmering under the sunlight. I moved into a small house just a few minutes from the base, a place with a porch that faced the lake and a soft wind that carried birdsong in the mornings. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was safe. It was ours. I unpacked slowly, one box at a time, letting each sound of tape peeling off feel like a layer of the past being lifted. Harper ran from room to room, barefoot, her hair flying behind her like a small flame. She laughed more now. She didn't always use words, but the sound that came from her chest was real, free, unbroken. In the months since the hearing therapy had become a steady rhythm in our lives. And then, one morning in late March, something changed. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a small cup of apple juice in her hand, staring out the window at the lake. I walked in behind her, still in PT gear from an early run. When she turned toward me, her lips moved, her throat trembled, and a sound that wasn't a whisper, but not quite a word, either escaped. She tried again. "Mom." Just one word. Fragile and soft, but perfect. My knees almost gave out right there. I knelt down, cupped her face gently in my hands, and whispered back, "I'm here." She said it again, stronger this time. "Mom." I didn't cry the way I thought I would. I didn't sob or fall apart. I just held her breathing in the scent of her hair, listening to that one word again and again, like it was the world being rebuilt from the ground up. The house near Spring Lake became more than just a home. It became a sanctuary. I kept my military career on base, but I no longer rushed between chaos and crisis. I built structure around Harper's healing. Her therapist came twice a week, her progress steady, her spirit rebuilding brick by brick. Some nights we would sit on the porch together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the reflection of the moon on the water. Harper would lean against me warm and quiet, and I would feel something I hadn't felt in years, peace that wasn't waiting to be shattered. It was during one of those quiet nights that the idea for Harper's Shield came to me. I had spent years working as military police, standing between soldiers and the things that threatened them. But what about the children of those soldiers? What about the ones who couldn't raise their voices? The ones who lived with their pain behind closed doors? Harper's story wasn't unique. That thought kept me awake longer than I wanted, so I started making calls. I met with JAG officers, CPS representatives, trauma counselors. I pitched something that didn't yet exist, a nonprofit foundation designed to support children of military families affected by domestic abuse. We called it Harper's Shield. The name came from Harper's favorite picture book, where a small girl carried a glowing shield made of her own courage. It began small. A few volunteers, a small office near the base, a website, a hotline. but word spread fast. Military families talk sometimes quietly, sometimes in whispers, but once they trust a space, they come. Within months, the foundation had counselors, legal advocates, and a small network of foster families who understood the unique pressure of military life. I wasn't just Ember Collins, the MP. I became the woman other soldiers trusted with their silent fears. And it felt right. Not easy, never easy, but right. Harper grew with it. She came to the office sometimes after school, sitting quietly in the corner with her books or sketching pictures while I met with caseworkers. She didn't have to speak to make people soften around her. Her presence alone told a story that didn't need words. The same little girl who once lay silent on the cold ground was now the heart of something powerful. In May 2026, she graduated from her first stage of trauma therapy. It wasn't a big ceremony. No banners, no stage. Just a group of kids sitting in a circle holding certificates with their names written in bright colors. But Harper's smile that day could have lit up the entire room. She walked up to receive her paper turned back and scanned the crowd until she found me. I was in uniform, not because I had to be, because she loved seeing me like that, steady, unshakable. She raised her certificate like a little warrior raising a flag. I clapped. Loud, louder than anyone else. My heart was so full I thought it might burst. When she came running back to me, certificate clutched in her small hand, I lifted her up and whispered, "You're brave, Harper. You always have been." She tucked her head against my neck, and I felt the steady, calm rhythm of her breathing. That was victory. Not in a courtroom, not in a battle, right there in my arms. After the graduation, I stood outside the center with Rebecca. She leaned against the railing, a coffee in her hand, watching Harper chase bubbles in the sun. "You did it," she said. I shook my head. "She did it." Rebecca looked at me and smiled. "You both did." She wasn't wrong. Rebecca had been with me through the worst of it. She had seen me standing in hospital hallways, courtroom aisles, empty nights filled with doubt. And now she was watching something else, a new chapter that wasn't built on pain, but on strength. The foundation grew quickly over the summer. More families reached out. More children received therapy protection, second chances. My role changed too. I wasn't just a soldier anymore. I was a mother, an advocate, a builder of something that might outlive me. Sometimes I'd stand in that small office watching the volunteers talk to families, watching the quiet way broken people started to trust again, and I'd feel that steady heat in my chest. It wasn't rage anymore. It was purpose. Harper started sleeping with the windows open again that summer. For a long time, she had needed them closed, locked, guarded. Now she liked to listen to the frogs by the lake. Every night before bed, she would check that her rabbit was on the nightstand, her flashlight under the pillow, and then she'd curl into her blanket and drift off. No panic, no waking up screaming, just quiet. She was healing in her own language, one soft step at a time. One evening in early June, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee while Harper drew with chalk on the walkway. She had drawn the lake, the house, the sky full of stars, and the two of us standing side by side. She even drew the shield. I asked her, "What's that?" She pointed to the shield and signed mine. I touched her hair and whispered, "Yes, baby. Yours." It struck me then that everything Linda and Tara had tried to take from us, Safety Trust Home, had been rebuilt piece by the same little girl they thought they could silence. They lost. Harper won. By July, Harper's Shield held its first fundraiser. Soldiers came, wives came, husbands, commanders, counselors. It wasn't a big, glamorous gala, just a gathering by the lake barbecue on picnic tables, kids running around with sparklers. I gave a short speech. I didn't talk about pain. I talked about resilience. I talked about how silence is not weakness, how the military family deserves protection, not just in combat zones, but at home. I didn't say Linda's name. She didn't deserve to be part of the story anymore. This story belonged to Harper. As the sun set over the lake, Harper tugged on my sleeve. She pointed at the sky where the last light bled into the water and whispered her second word since that spring, quiet but clear. Home. I felt it all the way down to my bones. I lifted her up and she wrapped her arms around my neck as the fireflies blinked in the dark. The night of the fundraiser, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch. Harper asleep in her room, and let the quiet fill me. For the first time in years, silence wasn't the echo of pain. It was the sound of a life rebuilt. I thought about the woman I had been when all of this started, the soldier who could face danger overseas but had trembled at the weight of family betrayal. I wasn't her anymore. I was something sharper, stronger. Not because I didn't feel pain, but because I had walked through it and built something on the other side. As I looked out at the lake, the moonlight spreading across the water like silver threads, I thought about every moment that had brought us here. The porch, the ICU, the courtroom, the fire pit. Justice isn't revenge, it's protection. And this time, it worked. Harper's shield wasn't made of steel or iron. It was made of a mother's rage, turned into action, of a child's silence, turned into strength of a community choosing to protect instead of look away. And as I breathed in the spring night, I knew that this was the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Not fear, not pain. Protection. Strength. Love. I know there will be other storms in life. The world doesn't stop turning after one victory, but I also know this Harper will never face them alone. Not as long as I live. And even after I'm gone, the shield we built together will still stand. So here's my question to anyone who's listening. Anyone who has ever faced something they thought would break them. Would you stand up the way I did? Would you protect the people you love even when it costs everything? Tell me. I want to know, because sometimes all it takes is one person standing firm for a story to change forever.